Is it recording?
Okay. That's for the next talk. I just So welcome everyone to this final workshop in the series of workshops organized by the research project When Experts Disagree. This is workshop number 6. On this occasion, we are collaborating with Cambridge Center for Study of Existential Risk, and Hume Price will say a few words about the center and its work at the beginning of his talk. But I'd like, first of all, to welcome all of you here to Dublin and to UCD. We have a lineup of exciting speakers and a variety of topics relevant to disagreement. I'm sure we'll end up all disagreeing about disagreement, but that's the whole purpose of this workshop. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce Paul Bogosian, who certainly, as you would agree, needs no introduction. Paul has been to Dublin many times, and I'm really delighted to have him back. He's a good friend of many of us here and a good friend of Ireland, and he's extremely well known for his work in philosophy of language, on the a priori, analyticity, and also on relativism, and that's one of our common interests. On this occasion, he's going to talk about disagreement. I'm not quite sure what, but like many papers today and tomorrow, his presentation will be a work in progress. That's why we're calling this a workshop, despite the large number of people attending, rather than a conference. But without further ado, here is Paul Bogosian.
Maria, thank you so much. Shinora Gallium, Maria. That's
our secret language, by the way.
That's for those of you who may not know, that's Armenian for thank you. And if you want to be invited again, I think the probabilities go up if you learn that and say that to Maria. But really, thank you for organizing so many interesting things in Dublin over the years. I'm still not entirely sure what I'm going to talk about, but I thought one thing that it would be useful to start a workshop on disagreement with is a foundational issue in the theory of disagreement, which is, are there limits on the extent to which people can disagree? And if so, what are those limits? And what do they stem from? Of course, so the most important such limit that people have thought traditionally exists is from the nature of meaning itself. So that there are certain considerations either about the nature of meaning constitution or about concept possession closely linked. I'm not going to be very fussy about the mind-language distinction for these purposes, although sometimes it can matter a great deal. And that if you really understand the way meaning is constituted, you will see that in some sense there is a sense in which there are substantive propositions on which it is not possible for people to disagree, because when you disagree about them, you've changed the subject enough so that you're no longer in genuine disagreement. So in other words, there will be sentences S and propositions P such that for S to mean P in your mouth, you have to assent to S in some sense. So that somebody dissenting from S doesn't mean the same thing as you do, so the thing that we need, which is that you're affirming something and the other person is rejecting that very thing, is not there. That's a crucial part of disagreement. And so we would say in that case that this would be a merely verbal disagreement. And the question is, are there verbal disagreements, and do they place any kind of boundary on the extent to which disagreements are possible? Now, this is all, every element in this is complicated, including, for of course, that when we talk about meaning constitution or my meaning something by a word, possessing a concept, we are now familiar with a whole slew of theories that require you to make various kinds of distinctions. So in particular, I'll just use as an example the kind of Bird-style social externalist views of meaning and concepts. And for those of you who know about this, what Burge argued is that for someone to possess a concept in the minimal sense of being able to entertain thoughts involving it, have thoughts containing it, they don't really need to be full masters of that concept. They can parasitically ride on the mastery that other people in the community have by roughly deferring to them. So the famous example is that of the concept arthritis. You have a person who has a fundamental misunderstanding about the concept arthritis, which is that the concept, he thinks he has arthritis in his thigh, and he goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, you can't have arthritis in your thigh, because arthritis is an ailment of the joints only. But the idea is, although this person has this kind of misunderstanding of a crucial conceptual role of the concept of arthritis, they still get to have arthritis. It's a mistake about arthritis that the person is making, not some specially tailored notion of arthritis, which could include our ailments, rheumatoid ailments of both the joint and the thigh. So what that kind of thing forces you to do is, if you like, to distinguish between the concept of possession of a concept and the notion of the mastery of a concept. And that distinction is presupposed in the way that experiment is set up. It's not imposed on it. It's really a crucial part of it. The idea is there is this thing which the doctor has, which is full mastery of the concept of arthritis, and you get to have that concept, even though you yourself don't have full mastery, by participating in a certain way in that linguistic or conceptual community. Now, I am going to be talking, for our present purposes, about the notion of full mastery rather than this kind of parasitic latching on. Okay? So not mere possession, but full mastery. And the root idea, of course, which is again exemplified in the Burge experiment, is that mastery is composed out of having in place the constitutive conceptual role of a concept. That's what the experts have. They instantiate that conceptual role. And some examples of the kind of conceptual role, I'm using assent very broadly, by the way, to mean either affirming a sentence or making inferences involving a sentence. That's a very broad notion of assent. None of these should matter for present purposes, but things that might be good candidates for, as it were, being constitutive assents that are part of having ingredient concept. So conjunction elimination in the case of conjunction, if Mary ate the apple and she ate the pear, then she ate the apple, or something classic like all squares of 4 equal size linked end to end. Whoever knows P believes P is constitutive of knowledge of know. An example of modus ponens, and thrown in for good measure a scientific example, either two events are simultaneous or they aren't. Now, the idea is that this idea that there are these limits imposed by the nature of concept constitution and mastery on the extent to which dissent is possible, of course, has been under persistent attack in the recent philosophy, starting, of course, with Quine. And Quine's point was that it's very hard to tell, or rather he put it in a way that's more significant because epistemic issues aren't really to the point, that there is no fact of the matter when a particular conceptual role or an assent is constitutive of the possession of a concept. And when it is just something that you believe, maybe very strongly believe, but which you, if you gave it up, would just be a kind of change of mind about the world. And the idea here is not that it's all just empirical, but rather that there is no fact of the matter. Now, actually, Quine didn't give much of an argument for this. It's an important challenge that he posed. Namely, how do you tell when you look at the totality of the dispositions that a person has, what is the marker for when something is meaning constituting and when it's just some very deeply held thing that is very unlikely to be given up, but wouldn't result in a change of meaning if you did give it up? And I think the answer to that is that, in fact, we do have fairly firm intuitions about when somebody does or does not have mastery of a concept. To the extent to which concepts are real, that is, the extent to which there are thoughts with content, and these contents are made up out of concepts, then there is a real subject matter there, and there is something that individuates them. And to the extent to which you think it is conceptual role that individuates them, then short of saying there are no determinate facts in this area, you have to think that the boundaries of the constitutive sense versus the non-constitutive sense is marked out. It's marked out simply by there being a real subject matter there. Now, of course, Quine realized this and went on to make much more radical claims about how there may not be a real subject matter in the case of meaning and concepts, and there may be nothing but indeterminacy. But that is to go down a very, very radical route, because when people were thought they were buying in simply on the denial of the analytic-synthetic distinction understood as I'm drawing it, they didn't think they were buying in on full-blown anti-realism about meaning. They just thought they were learning something about meaning facts as we have them. And in fact, Quine himself eventually came around to the view that, yes, there were certain constitutive assents, and when you gave them up, there would be a change of meaning. So in the Roots of Reference, a late work, he says, yes, it's true, a change of logic is a change of subject matter, meaning there are certain very basic logical truths such that if you did not affirm them, then you would just end up saying something else. So, I think one of the things that you see the kind of firmness of our intuitions about concept description and what it takes in a lot of different places. One of them is, of course, it's not usually taken to be the moral. But if you look at Witten Stein's investigation in the philosophical investigations about the student learning to expand the series +2, or to have mastery of the concept of addition and so on, these are all, what he's looking for is enough mastery of the conceptual role of addition in simple enough cases before the instructor is willing to say, okay, I think he's got it now. Right? And then when something happens at the point 1000, and suddenly instead of adding 2, he's adding 4, things get thrown into a little bit of turmoil. What are we going to say? And then, after a while where there's a regularity there, I said, well, maybe this person, in response to the same training, this is bizarre, but maybe happens, found it natural to glom onto the concept +2 up to 1000 +4 thereafter. Okay, so this is really tracking, as it were, the conceptual role of the concept and drawing conceptual descriptions on that basis. And when we look at that, we respond very naturally as though he's doing exactly the right thing. Where do we look? We look to conformity with basic conceptual role. It also shows up, of course, in these social externalist thought experiments. That is, these are based on very firm intuitions about which concept it is that the experts have, what the conceptual role is of arthritis, and then in what respects the person has deviated from that canonical conceptual role, and to what extent deference can make up for the slack in the understanding, either partial or misunderstanding. So, in many respects, I think the Quinean challenge can be answered. But recently, there has been a second wave of attack in a different form, initiated by Tim Williamson against the idea of constitutive assent. And Williamson's idea is to show that no particular assent could be constitutive of the possession of a given concept, because for any such putative assent, he believes he has a recipe that can generate a counterexample to it. And this is, I guess, all inspired in the end by Van McGee. Now, Van McGee, this brilliant logician, who thought he had come up with a counterexample to certain kinds of special cases of modus ponens. These are embedded cases of modus ponens, and most people dispute that they're really counterexamples, but in any case, he thought they're counterexamples, and for all we know, he modified his inferential behavior so as never to reason in a modus ponens-y way when conditionals are embedded within other conditionals under certain circumstances. But now, who would want to say that McGee does not understand conditional? If modus ponens is constitutive of conditional, here's an example of somebody who understands it as well as anyone, full master, yet he is denying the thing you said previously was constitutive. Well, maybe we'll learn that wasn't constitutive, but that would become a bit embarrassing as you have to keep repeating that retreat time after time. Because here's a general recipe. For any principle that you think is constitutive, I'm going to imagine some expert who, by developing theoretical, even though potentially misguided, misgivings about the principle, gets to stop assenting to the principle while clearly retaining full mastery. We're not going to deny full mastery to Van McGee or any of these guys or gals. Now this, Williamson devotes about 100 pages of the philosophy of philosophy to laying this kind of counterexample out. And it's done in a very, very detailed way. And it has had a huge amount of influence. One now sees people routinely say, there can be no constitutive assent because, after all, we're subject to this kind of Williamsonian counterexample. But I think this counterexample, or this recipe for generating counterexamples, isn't any good. And one of the reasons it's no good is because no person developing a conceptual role semantics for a concept would do it in ways that are vulnerable to this particular kind of counterexample. So let me explain what I mean. What Williamson has, the recipe depends on this person being an expert. Okay? Not just even an ordinary speaker, but somebody who's got reflective views about the concept and has got deep theoretical misgivings of a misguided or not misguided kind about the validity of certain transitions. But if you read any conceptual role semanticist, you start with, really the modern wave in conceptual role semantics starts with Chris Peacock. And let me quote a little bit from Peacock's description of the concept conjunction. Conjunction is that concept C to possess which is a classic sentence. To possess which a thinker must find transitions of that are instances of the following forms primitively compelling, and must do so because they are of those forms. And here he's talking about the canonical rules for conjunction, introduction, elimination. To say that the thinker finds such transitions primitively compelling is to say this one, he finds them compelling. Two, he does not find them compelling because he has inferred them from other premises and or principles. And three, for possession, really you should read mastery, of the concept C in question here, conjunction, he does not take the correctness of the transitions as answerable to anything else. Okay. And if you look, for instance, at Stephen Schiffer's way of developing conceptual role semantics, you'll see that he talks about, instead of primitively compelling, he talks about underived. Okay. Obviously, when you're talking about very basic concepts, you're trying to explain how you build up a conceptual repertoire. The conceptual roles in question that are constitutive can't be themselves derived from some higher order theory or some higher level theory or whatever, more sophisticated theory. And anyway, whatever you identify as constitutive, obviously you can come up on top of that, have misgivings about it, and alter your behavior. If I came to believe that all swans are taller than 10 feet, well, maybe that would alter my behavior with the word swan, so that I'd be prepared to infer that something is greater than 10 feet just because it's a swan. But that doesn't alter the, as it were, primitively compelling inferences that are genuinely constitutive of the concept swan. This is a theoretical addition, either of an additive kind or a subtractive kind. So I think what people have misunderstood is these as attacks on the conceptual role semantics and the idea of constitutive assent, these expert-generated counterexamples are actually useless. So we don't need to worry about them. Now, it's true that what we have here are dispositions to assent that are constitutive, not actual assents. And the question is, well, what's the significance of that? It's not as though we can say we will never expect competent dissent, because you can get competent dissent via this expert route. But it's that certain transitions, principles, whatever, have a kind of default status. Okay. By virtue of being grounded in the nature of the meanings involved, there's a certain kind of entitlement. I'm not going to go into the story by which that's shown to be true. There's a certain kind of entitlement that you have to them, which therefore places the burden on the opponent to dislodge them via whatever theoretical considerations they want to invoke. And this has certain implications for the epistemology of the a priori in these domains, which I'm not, as I say, I'm not going to go into detail about that, but that's the significant. Now, there is one domain, though, in which, a very important domain, in which I think there aren't these understanding, grounded limits on disagreement or dispositions to disagreement. And that is the normative domain. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So about the normative domain, I mean, of course, judgments about what ought to be the case or what one has reason to do or to believe. And most typically, I'll be talking about judgments of morality and judgments of justification or rationality. Now, it's an old view that the normative is special in this regard, that normative concepts don't by themselves embed substantive normative truths. But this is a very interesting thing, if true. That is, you have the factual domain, which, if I'm correct, has a lot of constitutive assent operating within it. But that the normative domain is different in this regard. Now, who was the first person to argue this? Well, the first person to argue this was, of course, G.E. Moore, as far as I know. And that is what the open question argument is. I mean, it's called different things, and people describe it in different ways, but the essence of the open question argument is to say, you can be, I mean, I'll describe it in my terms. You, as a competent master of what is right and wrong, could believe a certain substantive moral truth, like, for instance, that torturing babies for fun is wrong. As little controversial a proposition as possible. Though even that, when I was giving it in a place where there were some determined relativists, somebody said, "Well, how much fun?" and drawing gasps from the room. I guess utilitarians have to sort of say that. It's a bit embarrassing. It doesn't look like it depends on how much fun, but okay. But Moore thought for any such thing. So let's distinguish between a trivial and a non-trivial moral proposition. A trivial one that would be constitutive and epistemically analytic in my terms is one that says, when I say that some act or act type is wrong, I am saying that I'm expressing a distinctive kind of moral disapproval that I have of it, and I am saying that it merits that distinctive kind of disapproval. Okay? Let's say that could be neutral ground. That's a trivial moral proposition. That you can know a priori. That's constitutive. If you didn't understand that, you wouldn't understand the notion of wrong, and so on and so forth. The question is how you use that as a basis for going on to certain substantive act types, like torturing babies for fun, or whatever, are themselves grounded in the nature of the relevant concept. Now, Hume, of course, famously said, "It's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." And that's a remarkable thing to say, but he's saying here, it's not only not contrary to the understanding, it's not even contrary to reason to have such a perverse preference. But even if we didn't go quite so far as that, it looks as though there is grounds for thinking that whatever might be going on with somebody who has as perverse a preference as the one that Hume describes, it wouldn't be because they're flouting some things about the concept better than. They understand what's better than what, and they happen to think that a world in which the world is destroyed rather than the world exists and that my finger be scratched is better. That's the view. That's maybe a crazy view, a false view, but it's not one that violates, as it were, your understanding of better than. The question is, what is the argument for this? And if you look at Moore, well, he gives you a lot of different things, but the one thing he gives you is a kind of affirmation of the thing I said Williamson hadn't provided. That is, in the restricted case of the normative concepts, he endorses this principle that we would have looked for from Williamson but didn't get. For any proposition P, it's possible for someone to have an underived disposition to dissent from P while retaining full competence with P. Okay. And in the special case of morality or normativity, for any non-trivial moral proposition P, it's possible for someone to have an underived disposition to dissent from P while retaining full competence with P. Now, I think Moore just thought this was obvious in the special case of morality. It may not be obvious to everybody how this works. But it seems to me that one can do a little bit more by way of shoring up that Moorian claim by supplying the following argument. So, you know, if we distinguish between trivial and substantive conceptions of right and wrong, so the trivial ones are just the little conceptual role that I mentioned, involving disapproval and merit of disapproval and so forth, and then substantive acts where particular act types are listed as being right and wrong, it seems as though if I had a substantive conception of wrong which packed in certain verdicts about certain act types, it looks as though, just like Moore thought, there is a kind of, I would put it this way, a correctness open question that I seem always to be able always to be in a position to put in a way that doesn't agree or coincide with other concepts. So what I mean is, suppose you said to me, according to my substantive concept of wrong, the following act types are wrong. It looks as though I can always competently say, yes, I know that that follows from your concept of right and wrong, but is that the concept that genuinely delivers correct normative results? I know it's packed into your concept, but just because it's packed into your concept doesn't mean that it's genuinely it's encoding the genuinely correct normative result. Now, contrast this with the case of a concept like square. If I said to you, according to my concept square, all squares have four sides, it doesn't seem right to say, well, yeah, that's your concept square, but I mean, is that the correct concept square, the one that really delivers on how many sides squares have? So there looks to be a disparity between the kind of open question about substantive normative concepts, and this will be true both of morality and of justification, as opposed to other concepts. There is an open question that I'm trying to put my finger on, that and that exists in the case of the normative concepts. Now, if that's right, of course, that means that even the kind of thing that we argued existed in the factual domain, dispositions to limits to the dispositions to dissent, don't exist here as a mere result of conceptual grounding. And that means that the consequent epistemology of the normative is going to be a lot more difficult and draw on much greater resources than anything that you can find just in the theory of the understanding. Now, how am I doing here?
I think maybe we can wrap it up in a couple of minutes. That is good.
You think I can? I don't know how you think I should. Okay. Well, okay, well, what I would have done is... I thought you said I got to decide. I think what I would have done at this point is talk about, given that this is so about the epistemology of the normative, then you see how certain kinds of, this is of course on realist assumptions. And what happens is that when you see that the understanding doesn't place any interesting limits on what can be thought in the case of the normative, you get, as a result, a tremendous pull either towards skepticism or towards anti-realism in the case of the normative domain. Now, skepticism, if you thought about it, in the case of rationality, which is itself a subspecies of normativity, I would argue is self-defeating. There is no way to make sense of a genuine skepticism about what counts as a justified belief. So what beckons are the anti-realist options. And And here, of course, the most significant one would be a relativistic construal of the normative. And if I had any time, and if people let me, I would have shown or would have argued that, in fact, relativism about the normative, strange as it may seem, because there are obviously good relativistic theses in other domains, like, for instance, in the case of the physical, is not an option. And that Parfit was right when he said, if normativity is real, then it is objective in some appropriate sense. There is no such thing as it were, a compromised notion of normativity. It simply goes away. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. So we have 10 minutes for questions.
So this is very inchoate, and it just relates to the things you were just saying. It was just trying to get what the reasoning was that you were trying to give voice to at the end, which might lead you to relativism, even though that's not the conclusion you want to embrace. And I kind of took it that you were saying, look, there's something weird about the normative case because we can have these disagreements as to what counts as the right thing to do, which can't be. So in the square case, you can't say, look, you've got a different concept, right? That's just, okay.
In the square case,
You can't say, look, I'm using a different concept to you, that's why we're disagreeing.
in the square case, you can say
Sorry,
that.
you can say that.
Yeah.
Apologies. And that's because it's like really simple. It's a really simple concept.
Well, it's not the reason I gave, but
But,
go on.
But okay, so what one thing might think is that it's a very simple concept, whereas something like what's wrong and right, that's quite complicated. There's other complicated concepts like what a person is. And I was just wondering that just because we get these capacities for disagreement, why would that, so we can't reach an intuitive verdict as to whether somebody's using that concept or a different one. Why would that lead us to embrace or be tempted by relativism? Why not just think, well, the concepts are more complicated here, so it just takes more to be master of that concept.
Number of strands going on here, but they don't fully correspond to what I was saying.
Yes, I
So
agree.
let me see if I can disentangle a little bit. I mean, one crucial thing that I was drawing on is that there is a correctness open question in the case of the normative concepts, but not in the case of other concepts. And by the way, one has to qualify that not qualify it, but fend off certain kinds of misunderstanding of that. So, for instance, and that's one of the reasons I put up this example up here: either two events are simultaneous or they aren't. Let me digress briefly on that.
It's false.
What?
It's false.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But the point is that its falsity can be accommodated in one of two ways. One of them is you think, yes, it really is simultaneity, but we got that wrong. Or the other is, no, relative to the old notion of simultaneity, this really was analytic. But what we learned is that you get a better empirical theory that in treating space-time separations in certain ways actually yields a three-place notion of simultaneity rather than a two-place notion of simultaneity. So this is always open, by the way, in the description of scientific progress. One of them is to say, Quine used to love, this was the thing he wanted to hammer on to. Now, the word is retained, the word is retained, and so shouldn't we just say, we were wrong about mass, or we were wrong about time, and so on, rather than saying that there was a discovery that prompted us to have a somewhat different conceptual framework, one that has relations to the old one, but the new theory is really couched in conceptually new terms. And I think in many such cases, there's plenty of good reason to tell the story that way. But the point I was trying to make is, therefore, you see, this notion of, in the normative case, there is a correctness open question, does it yield the right results? And I'm contrasting this with the concept square, or the concept simultaneity, or the concept mass, and saying, at best, in those other cases, you don't get a question like that. You do get a question of what should be the basic notions in your scientific theory over which you quantify. which doesn't address the question what is or is not analytic of those concepts. But it's not about the complexity, it seems to me, of the relevant issue, of the relevant notion. It really does seem to get at, what is and what is not encoded, and what individuates the concept, if I'm right. Now, if I were Mark Richard, I'd say, am I being responsive? I'm not Mark Richard, so I'm not going to do that.
Okay. Adrian?
I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing what the relationship is supposed to be between mastery and constitutive assent, because there's lots of different relationships those two things could have, and I couldn't quite see how Williamson's argument is supposed to work and how your response to it is supposed to work, unless I know what that relationship is. So can you tell me what's going on?
Sorry, there's mastery and constitutive assent.
Yeah, I took it that like Williamson's counterexample was supposed to be, look, I've got a bunch of experts who can deny constitutive, they can not do that assenting bit, but still have mastery.
Right. Now, okay.
So there has to be some relationship between those two things, and I didn't catch it.
Okay, good. So what I was saying is mastery is constituted by primitively compelling assent. That is, assent not derived from anything, just reflective of the nature of the concept involved. So it's just not derived on the basis of any superadded theory or higher level thinking and so on, that if Mary ate the apple and she ate the pear, then she ate the apple. Now, Williamson can come along and say, look, actually assenting to this cannot be required, because I can come up with an expert who refuses to assent to it because they've got their reasons. Now, that does not refute conceptual role semantics, because conceptual role semantics has to be based on the primitively compelling transitions. So modifying them with some kind of super theory doesn't get at the fact that, so in other words, another way of putting that is to say the person, even Van McGee, presumably still finds modus ponens primitively compelling, even if he's come to have doubts about it, and expresses those doubts. So that's just by way of showing that conceptual role semantics, and that is the role of constitutive dispositions to assent, or if you like, intuitions to assent, intuitions to find compelling, are not touched by these expert examples. Now, Williamson, of course, has an unerring sense of dialectic, and so he tried to push the step one step further to say, look, take these experts. Maybe after a period of time, they forget the theoretical reasons on the base. First of all, they started modifying their conceptual role in a way that did not conform to what you're saying. Then they forgot the theoretical reasons on the basis of which they did this. And then, so they say nothing. When you ask them why, they just say, oh, it just strikes me as obvious that it doesn't follow that if Mary ate the apple and she ate the apple. So really getting at the claim that finding them primitively compelling is constitutive. And the answer is, at that point, the example is no longer so plausible, because if the person gives you no special reason for denying that if A and B is true, then A is true, then you think, well, I don't know what's going on here. So the concept has gotten modified in some way. And so...
we might come back to it. So, Luke?
Well, I had a question, actually, as a physicist, about the peculiar status of mathematics, which is, in some sense, the last bastion of the a priori.
Well, with some other ones.
Yeah. But mathematics is the role of, well, the interplay between mathematics and physics is a very interesting one. And in some sense, mathematical truths are undeniable. But how does this link into physics, where you can have somebody, for example, like Schrödinger, who was certainly a master of quantum mechanics, but denied it. He said, it can't be right. Just as an intuitive response to the apparent paradoxes.
Well, I mean, so you're not asking about mathematics, you're asking about physics.
Well, I'm asking about the relationship between
Yeah.
mathematics, which could claim a sort of a priori absolute truth,
Yeah.
and physics, where, in a very real sense, no physicist would ever claim to be a complete master of his subject, because our knowledge in physics is conditional and always subject to revision.
Absolutely. And so already you've put your finger on one of the crucial divides, at least for traditionalists like myself, and I'm very glad to recruit you to my side, that there is this thing we call the a priori and posteriori divide. And that certain things like mathematics and logic, by the way, many people think that the role of mathematics in science can be exhausted by logic. So you can just do a kind of reduction of the mathematical aspects to kind of somewhat long-winded logical formulations. But that's a bright red line. Now, this bright red line is something that Quine very much wanted to erase. This is what post-Quine philosophy is about. There is no real distinction between the a priori and the posteriori. They're all in the same soup. You know, logic is in there along with quantum mechanics, and you know, many people argued, Putnam von Neumann, that quantum mechanics required revisions to logic. The distributive principles, allegedly, if you were to give them up, would clarify certain aspects of the foundations of quantum mechanics for you. Now, I believe that that's wrong, and you don't get much mileage out of it. But in any event, it does cross this bright red line. Now, the bright red line is a big dividing point. It's a contested line. But one of the things that I've been trying to do is defend it. So.
One last final.
Another question from a physicist, if I may, but the issue of technology always gets left out of the conversation, and I'd be very curious to see how do commentators like Williamson and Quine, address the issue of modern technology that works. Let's say your mobile phone. I mean, in the first case, the whole relativist idea of that there's no fact of the matter seems very strange if somebody builds a purpose-built device on a certain principle and it works. But also in terms of the Williamson thing that there's no actual assent. I mean, scientists agree to a certain extent. They may not have the full knowledge of quantum theory, but they know enough to agree to manufacture this device. Now, the person who makes it, the engineer, may not know that. He's simply given instructions, and the customer may not need to know that. But it's very hard to explain, if we really live in a relativist world. I think the physicist always finds it very hard to understand how can you explain then that these things work.
Of course.
An answer to that?
Now, in fairness to Williamson, I should point out that he's very far from being a relativist. He's the opposite. When I was saying when I was saying that certain kinds of moves that you might make in the theory of normativity and its relation to the theory of the understanding make relativism seem more appealing to you than it might otherwise have been. I was listing that as a theoretical challenge for us to overcome, not because I was saying that anybody out there actually found it appealing, though that there are people who do. So, but not Williamson. You're absolutely right that there is this, when for those people who think that even epistemic judgments about what it would be warranted to believe given the evidence, are themselves not absolute judgments, but rather depend on the optional epistemic system that you happen to be operating. There would be a challenge to explain, as you say, how it is that the technology works down to the incredibly precise numbers with which it works. So we're in agreement about that. But in philosophy, we sometimes take things seriously that just because we have to.
Okay, so this is a good point to end this first session. And thank Paul for a very Adam Parker, chairing the sessions. Thank you.
And this.
That's okay. Yeah.
So you can look at it and
Okay. That's perfect. Thank you. Cheers. That's perfect. Thanks. Hi, Charlotte. How are you?
Thanks. I think we have.
So just this, if you, I think it's here.
It's Archimedean metanorms. I think I'd scroll down. It's not that one. I'd keep going. There, it's up. Sorry. Yep, that's it. That should do it.
Not doing anything. No, it's just, it will protect on there.
Looks like it should be right to that. Does this have to be cancelled?
Yeah. It doesn't protect anything. I don't know why. We pressed it.
Is it in presentation mode?
Yeah, it should be. It is recording.
Right, but it's not that you
That looks like, yeah.
Oh, good. And it's, yeah, it's everything on.
Is it recording?
Yeah, can I just do view full screen? I don't want to jinx it. It's... Okay.
Okay, so next up we have Adam Carter from the University of Glasgow who's going to talk about Archimedean metanorms.
Thank you very much. I'll say a little bit about what the title means. You'll know what I mean when I get to the slide where I explain what that means. But what I'm interested in, what I'm going to talk about, are arguments that you've probably encountered before that begin with facts about what appear to be irresolvable disagreements, and which then shift all the way from these facts about allegedly irresolvable disagreements to the conclusion that relativism is true. Now, there's one style of argument that faultless disagreements, John McFarlane, and contemporary philosophy of language. I'm not talking about this type of disagreement. Those type of arguments move from facts about our semantic patterns of attributing certain types of epistemic states and claim that a relativist semantics better explains that pattern of use than, say, a contextualist or an invariantist semantics. But there's a different type of argument, again, that moves from disagreements to relativism. And this is a type that Richard Rorty referred to in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which Paul describes in his book on relativism when sort of framing a certain type of argument strategy where you look at particular actual historical disagreements, and what the relativist likes to do sometimes is say, look at this disagreement, there are certain properties of this disagreement, and on the basis of the presence or absence of certain properties about actual disagreements, we should conclude that relativism is true. And arguments of this form have played an important role in the history of both skepticism and relativism. Allegedly irresolvable disagreements feature in the Pyrrhonian mode of disagreement, which takes as a starting point a dispute against the background assumption that at most one of the interlocutors is right. They can't both be right. And then from the fact of the alleged irresolvability of the first order dispute, the conclusion that's drawn is that we should suspend judgment. After all, only one of us can be right. We can't, in the case of the argument, there can't be any resolution, or there isn't a resolution to be found, so we should suspend judgment. That's the Pyrrhonian skeptic's conclusion. Now, there's a way to run a twist on this argument, and this is what Rorty's relativist, as well as in a more contemporary setting, Stephen Hales is a relativist who's also made this type of a move, where we reject the background assumption that at most one party is right, and then take the fact of the irresolvable disagreement as philosophically interesting, but not in a way that gets us the Pyrrhonian skeptic's conclusion, because that wouldn't follow if we reject the background assumption that most one party is right. Rather, what Hales thinks we should conclude from disagreements that appear to be irresolvable is that both parties are right. P is true relative to S1's perspective, not P is true relative to S2's perspective, which is tantamount to being an epistemic relativist. So that's a way to move from an irresolvable disagreement to relativism rather than skepticism. But what to make of this argument? Of course, we can look at various kinds of historical cases where it seems as though such disputes are irresolvable, and normally what we find in such cases are not just a lack of a consensus on the first order proposition or a disagreement about the standards, but a disagreement about how to even go about locating the type of standards that would be relevant to adjudicate the first order dispute. Now, the type of irresolvability that is relevant to these types of arguments is not practical irresolvability, which might be at play if maybe two parties can't resolve a dispute because they don't have working vocal cords, or time-consumingness irresolvability. The type of irresolvability that's at play is not a matter of don't have time to argue about it. Rather, what is relevant and what features in these arguments that the relativist puts forward is something like rational irresolvability. The disagreement is rationally irresolvable. And here's a famous case of Bellarmine and Galileo, which is often a reference point in the relativist literature, especially pertaining to these types of arguments, that's meant to illustrate this. So raise your hand if you're somewhat familiar with this dispute between Galileo and Bellarmine. Okay, that's great. I won't bore you with details. So yeah, there's a disagreement about a first order proposition, and then there's a disagreement about whether or not you should follow Bellarmine and use the Bible as the method or the standard relative to which we should adjudicate the first order dispute, or follow Galileo and use the telescope as the relevant epistemic standard to determine whether or not there are moons circling Jupiter. Now Richard Rorty says, just give up. They're either they're both right. Actually, he says later that I guess Galileo won. That's only because we're evaluating that from our standpoint. But from the perspective in which they're arguing against one another, Rorty thinks that these are opposing epistemic grids, such that one party is right relative to one fundamentally different grid, and the other party is right relative to another. And in his most sardonic moments, I mean, he says this in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, but in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, he thinks that the only point would just be to, I guess, talk until both parties go home. So there's no way to resolve this disagreement in a rational manner. Now, Harvey Siegel articulates in a way that I think is helpful the type of thinking that Rorty and now Stephen Hales have in mind when pointing to facts about what happens between interlocutors like this that should lead us toward relativism. He says not only do the two parties disagree about the truth of the relevant claim, about Galileo affirmed the existence of the moons orbiting Jupiter while his opponents denied it, they also disagreed about the relevant standards. Telescope, naked eye observation, scripture, Aristotle, to which appeal should be made in order to resolve their disagreement. As Siegel's not a relativist, but he's again articulating in a succinct way the reasoning. The relativist here claims that there cannot be a non-relative resolution of the dispute concerning the existence of moons precisely because there is no neutral, non-question begging way to resolve the dispute concerning standards. And he goes on to suggest that in this way, the absence of neutral meta-standards seems to make the case for relativism. So this is an interesting way to sort of condense the rationale on behalf of the relativist. The absence of appropriately neutral meta-standards seems to make the case for relativism, or so the argument is supposed to go. So it looks like this is Siegel encapsulating how the position would work. There can be a non-relative resolution of the dispute concerning the existence of moons only if there is available an appropriately neutral meta-norm or meta-standard. I'm using meta-norm as a general way to refer to either a rule of the form believe this way or an epistemic principle which would say beliefs of the form such and such are justified. In the context of the dispute between Galileo and Bellarmine, no such appropriately neutral meta-norm is available. Therefore, it's not the case that there can be a non-relative resolution of the dispute concerning the existence of moons. That's how the reasoning goes. Now, of course, the careful reader might be thinking, but wait a minute, that isn't actually relativism. And that's true. To get to relativism, you need to find some sort of a bridge premise to get you from 3 to 4. And Hales defends such a bridge premise in his recent work. We'll get to that later, but first, what to make about the way this is set up? What to make of premises 1 and 2 of this type of argument on behalf of the relativist. So the guiding questions I want to consider are this. In particular, let's start by looking at 2. In the context of the dispute between Galileo and Bellarmine, no such appropriately neutral meta-norm is available. What I want to explore is 2 questions. So firstly, and this is what I'll focus the most on in this talk. What exactly is the thing, the appropriately neutral meta-norm, that Galileo and Bellarmine are said to be unable to locate in their dialectical context? And in what exact sense is this thing unavailable to them? So that's one question. A second question is, okay, so suppose we can specify what it is that they can't locate. Why should it matter whether they could or could not locate such a thing in the context of their dispute? In particularly, why should the matter of whether epistemic relativism is true turn on this kind of a fact? Whether they're able to find a particular thing, which question 1 is going to try to specify. And what considerations are relevant in determining this? So let's start with the first question. What exactly is this thing, this appropriately neutral meta-norm that Galileo and Bellarmine are said not to be able to find? And more generally, that individuals locked in deep disagreements are said not to be able to find, such that that's supposed to matter for whether relativism is true. Here's how Hales and Siegel, they give us this kind of a picture about what it would be. This is at a level of generality. So there's a target proposition, person 1 and person 2, P. Person 1 has standard 1 and person 2 has standard 2, different standards, maybe telescope and Bible. What it would be, what a meta-standard would be something like this. Some standard that could help to adjudicate between standards 1 and standards 2, which are the standards that each respectively uses vis-a-vis P. And that would be the sort of thing. So being able to latch on to a mutually agreed meta-standard that is the sort of thing that Galileo and Bellarmine are unable to locate. Now, of course, Bellarmine and Galileo could certainly locate a meta-standard. That's not the problem. And perhaps they could locate many meta-standards. But the argument says that what they can't find specifically is an appropriately neutral one. So appropriately neutral. The way that Siegel articulates this and setting this up is in terms of question beggingness. So let M be metanorm is appropriately neutral with respect to the epistemic standards S1 and S2 if and only if M can be non-question beggingly accepted by A and B with respect to epistemic standards S1 and S2. So that's how Siegel's thinking of appropriate neutrality. But I think we should stop for a moment and say, but wait a minute, setting things up that way renders the second premise of the argument obviously false. The reason is that, consider a meta-standard appropriately neutral to the debate in question. One of them is, I don't know, say something like logic, or perhaps more specifically, modus ponens. Very plausibly, Galileo and Bellarmine could both appeal to modus ponens in an attempt to adjudicate whether or not the Bible or the telescope is better evidence about moons without begging the question against one another. To see why, just imagine for a moment the following fake argument between Galileo and Bellarmine. Galileo says, well, P, because the telescope says so. Bellarmine says not P, because the Bible says so. Galileo says, the Bible can't be as good a source of evidence about the moons as the telescope, he says, pointing to the telescope. And Bellarmine says, well, the telescope can't be as good a source of evidence about moons as the Bible, he says, pointing to the Bible. And then Galileo, now let's introduce an appropriately neutral metanorm. Well, I believe in modus ponens, so there's that. And then Bellarmine can say, well, me too. And then Galileo, we can imagine, okay, well, great, that doesn't really help us. And indeed, I think that that's precisely what the response would be in such a circumstance in which a very neutral position that's shared in between both that could function as a metanorm is identified as common ground. Big deal. Suppose you even go further and say a tautologous metanorm, if A, then infer A. They could easily accept that. But to the extent that that's the case, we have an uncharitable way of framing the argument on behalf of the relativists, so we should change it just a little bit. And particularly, the argument attributed to the relativist needs a more charitable reconstruction because 2 is manifestly false. And because it is, this suggests we would need to amend 1 so that with an amended version of 2, 3 would follow. Now, in order to make 2 more plausible, and again, just to be clear, premise 2 of that argument is false, the idea that they can't find an appropriately neutral metanorm, because they can. Pretty easily. All you have to do is just identify a tautology or something like that. And I think what would need to be done in order to make premise 2 of the argument more plausible on behalf of the relativist would be to consider again the fake dialogue. A really neutral metanorm didn't seem to be of any use to either interlocutor. While neither Bellarmine nor Galileo is in a position to object to each other relying on modus ponens is plausibly not going to be appropriately, and I'm just using this word in a special case here, it's not appropriately discriminatory. So let's say it's not capable of assisting the interlocutors to move toward one rather than the other position in the context of their dispute. And this is precisely because of its neutrality. It's so neutral that it is incapable of moving the interlocutors toward one position rather than another. So it's not appropriately discriminatory. Now, unsurprisingly, if there's another side to the coin, if a metanorm does very well in the discriminatory role, it's plausibly going to fail to be appropriately neutral. And in one limit of discriminatoriness, the metanorm would just be the first order norm. So I'm going to put these 2 ideas together and now explain the title. A metastandard can plausibly play the kind of role that it would have to play in order to facilitate bringing interlocutors locked into an otherwise irreconcilable position into a rational resolution only if it is not merely suitably neutral in the way that was characterized by Siegel. Not just if it's suitably neutral, but also it has to be, in some sense, non-inert or suitably discriminatory. So from here on in, let's call a metanorm that can play these 2 roles, that it's both in the context of a dispute appropriately neutral and appropriately discriminatory in the sense that it could potentially, if both parties accepted it, count more toward one position than the other such that rational adjudication would be possible. Call such a metanorm Archimedean, and I was thinking of that term because it's a metanorm that would be able to play the role such that you could latch onto it and move the disputants toward one position rather than another. So this is a more plausible construal of premise 2, and the what Siegel calls the no neutrality, therefore relativism argument. There can be a non-relative resolution to the dispute concerning the existence of moons only if there is an Archimedean metanorm available. But, and then now premise 2 is starting to look a little bit more plausible, but there's not. In the dispute between Galileo and Bellarmine, maybe there isn't such a metanorm available, one that's both suitably neutral in the context of the dispute and suitably discriminatory. So, in what follows now, I'm going to raise 3 problems for the would-be relativist who attempts to appeal to this spiced-up version of the no neutrality, therefore relativism argument, which makes reference to the idea of what's missing in a certain dispute between Galileo and Bellarmine that should lead us to relativism is an Archimedean metanorm. So the 3 problems I want to raise for the prospects of the relativist who wants to argue this way are what I'll call a definitional problem, a kind of methodological problem, and an epistemic problem. And I'll start with the definitional problem. So you might have anticipated that problem, which is what counts as appropriately discriminatory. And again, the relativist had better be able to say what that is, because after all, the claim is that there can be a non-relative resolution of a dispute only if there is an Archimedean metanorm available, and an Archimedean metanorm is one that just simply has 2 roles. It's both appropriately neutral in the context of the dispute and appropriately discriminatory. But what counts as appropriately discriminatory? Thus far, we've just defined it in the negative as not so neutral that appealing to it could not assist the project of rational adjudication. Thus, a norm, if P, then believe P. That would be a norm that is not appropriately discriminatory for that reason. But what would a positive characterization of appropriate discriminatoriness look like? Here's one first crack at it. A metastandard M is appropriately discriminatory in a context, yada yada, if either the first order norms is made more probable by the metanorm. So if you think about in the picture of here's the metanorm up here, here's the first order standards, and then here's the proposition P versus not P. Here's telescope, here's Bible, here's the metanorm. Maybe appropriately discriminatory just means that one of these 2 standards has to be made more probable by the metanorm. Maybe that's what appropriate discriminatoriness means. So that's a first crack at thinking about it. I don't think this is going to work very well for the relativist for a couple of reasons. First off, note that from each perspective, S1 and S2, each might believe, given what they already hold, that a certain metanorm makes their own position more probable than the other. So in a sense, indexing the notion of probability to the types of epistemic standards that are already featuring in the dispute isn't necessarily going to help articulate a notion of discriminatoriness that's going to do any work, which would count in favor of an objective notion of probability, according to which maybe a metanorm is discriminatory vis-a-vis 2 first-order norms if it objectively makes more probable one versus the other. Then it's not inert. 2 problems with this. On the one hand, the kinds of appropriately neutral metastandards that are often appealed to are maybe necessary truths, and it's not clear that a necessary truth is going to make objectively probable one first-order norm more so than the other. But even in setting aside that issue, probability raising, this is, I think, a more serious problem. Probability raising as rationally significant takes for granted a certain kind of epistemic standard, one that not all epistemic systems are going to accept. For example, the Azandi, who are going to listen to the poison oracle. Now, this means that built into the very notion, so this, when I say this, I mean this opting for an objective notion of probability to articulate discriminatoriness as a way to define an Archimedean metanorm. That means that built into the very notion of what it would take for a norm to be discriminatory is something that is not neutral in contexts such as the Azandi. But that seems like a problem for the would-be relativist who wants to characterize an Archimedean metanorm in terms of discriminatoriness and then couch discriminatoriness in a certain way that is not going to be suitably neutral with respect to certain disputes, for the reason that the definition of an Archimedean metanorm in the relativist argument should work universally in the sense that it should be able to be stated at a certain level of generality. The type of argument that the relativist is appealing to shouldn't rely on a notion such that that notion is already loaded in favor of one epistemic standard as opposed to another. So again, let's ask the question again. So again, clearly neutral enough metanorm isn't the thing that's going to be interesting for the purpose of the relativist who wants to move from disagreement to relativism, because the second premise of that argument would be false on a notion of suitable neutrality. We need an Archimedean metanorm. But that just involves a metanorm that's suitably neutral and suitably discriminatory, and yet we haven't yet found a notion of discriminatoriness that seems to work. Let's try another one. Maybe a metastandard M is appropriately discriminatory in a context where two individuals are disagreeing about a target proposition and have different first-order standards. And they're such that maybe the metanorm plays the following role. S1 and S2, maybe they differ in the sense in which they depend on that metanorm. Maybe that would be enough to get to say that the metanorm is suitably discriminatory vis-a-vis one epistemic standard as opposed to the other. One interlocutor depends on that metanorm more. A problem with that is that if we think of this as individual one, they have whatever evidence they have that leads them to believe their favored epistemic standard, telescopic evidence or Bible. And then imagine this is the metanorm down here, the metanorm that either the interlocutors agree about or not, about how to adjudicate whether this is a good standard. We could articulate a difference of depending on M in this way. We could say if A doubted M, A couldn't rationally believe S1 on the basis of whatever her evidence is for it. But maybe B is different in this respect. Maybe if B doubted M, B could rationally believe 2 on the basis of whatever her evidence is for S2. Maybe that's a way to define what discriminatory would be in the context of figuring out what an Archimedean metanorm is. A problem for that, though, is that all that does is potentially raise a further problem. In the language of Crispin Wright and Jim Pryor, if you are in a position where you can't rationally believe this on the basis of this, if you doubted that, means that arguments that take for granted this metanorm are going to be dialectically ineffective for one party. Now, both Wright and Pryor both suggest that they differ with respect to how bad that is. But nonetheless, all drawing attention to a difference of dependence on the metanorm is going to reveal is that maybe appealing to the metanorm is going to be more dialectically ineffective than the other. It would be for the other party, which isn't really helping. If anything, it's making it more difficult to see how rational adjudication would be possible by reference to an Archimedean metanorm. So maybe let's try another articulation of discrimination. Maybe a metastandard is appropriately discriminatory in a context where A and B disagree about the truth of the proposition, and they disagree about what epistemic standards are relevant to determining the truth of the proposition, just in case the metanorm M plays the following functional role. If A and B were to correctly identify M as common ground between them, then A and B couldn't easily fail at, or would easily enough succeed at, reaching an agreement with respect to P, one way or another if they tried. Maybe that's the type of thing, a metanorm defined that way, such that Bellarmine and Galilei couldn't find it. And interestingly, if you can't find that thing, it should lead you to relativism. But a problem is that whether or not A and B are likely to reach an agreement if they try is oftentimes a matter of non-epistemic facts, such as tiredness. But these kind of facts are plausibly entirely irrelevant to whether relativism is true. And I'll return to that point. So the picture that the relativist gives us, according to which the inability of disputants to find this certain thing should lead us to relativism, suffers from a certain problem. It's hard to articulate what the thing is that they're supposed to find, such that if they don't find it, then relativism's true. And I've just explained that by suggesting that it's not clear how to articulate what it is that they're supposed to find. It looks like they should find a metanorm that's both suitably neutral and suitably discriminatory. It's hard to articulate a notion of discriminatoriness that would work. There's also a methodological problem. So, a problem for the relativists. So, implicit in the sort of naive neutrality view, the idea that what they're looking for is a suitably neutral thing, even if we give it the Archimedean spin and say, well, they're not just looking for a suitably neutral thing, but a suitably neutral and discriminatory thing. Common to this way of thinking is that what availability would mean, the idea of whether or not such a metanorm is available, is something like mutual findability. If they can both find it. At least this is Siegel's gloss, and also the way Hales describes the setting in his case of what he calls Jack and Diane, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But this invites what we call a methodology question. So what exactly is involved in the activity of finding an Archimedean metanorm when that activity is successful? So when interlocutors actually do find the thing, according to the relativist, if they didn't find or couldn't find in the right kind of way in the context of their dispute, then this would be motivation for relativism. Okay. Right now it's already 35 minutes? Okay. I'll wrap this bit up really quickly. Here's a very naive thing that you could say. You could say, well, here's the locating the common belief answer to the methodology question. Well, there's some Archimedean metanorm M such that A and B both believe that M is true, and through dialogue they come to believe that both A and B believe that it's true. So that's probably what, at least that's the way we might imagine what it would be to find a metanorm in the context of a dispute. We both believe the metanorm, and we both believe that each other believes the metanorm. One problem with that is that, well, I'm going to skip this problem. One problem with this is that it already rules it already rules situations in which two expressivists who already don't believe in any metanorms because they're expressivists, it has the consequence that such disputes are evidence for relativism. So if Alan Gibbard and Michael Ridge, two epistemic expressivists, get in an argument and they don't, given that they don't believe any metanorms, they think that these are express attitudes. According to this way of articulating the answer to the methodology question, we would immediately have to conclude relativism on the basis of facts about expressivists disagreeing, which doesn't seem very good. I'm not gonna be able to get through this. I'm gonna close with a final just comment. I've suggested that it doesn't make much sense, at least the way, or what I've been arguing so far. It doesn't really make much sense how to think of what this special thing is that is supposed to be found, such that if you don't find it, then we should move to relativism, and the type of argument that I've been articulating. But an even more serious problem is that even if you could say exactly what that thing was in a perfectly suitable way, it's not clear that the relativist has any advantage over the skeptic, or could move from facts about the inability to find some sort of a norm that would play this kind of a role, why that should move us to relativism as opposed to skepticism. And that is an even deeper problem. So there's two serious problems. You can't even explain what it is that they can't find, the relativist can't, and even if you could, it's not clear that articulating the argument in such a way is going to motivate relativism over skepticism. Didn't have time to talk about the second part, but I discussed that in my book, why it is that a lot of arguments for relativism reach a juncture where it's not clear how you could non-arbitrarily move to relativism rather than skepticism. Thank you.
Do you want to answer a question?
Yes, I do. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, hi, thanks a lot for that. I really like the way you set that up. I have a really just basic diagnostic question. I think something I didn't understand about, it's really a burden of proof question. I wasn't sure why you described the difficulties that plague trying to articulate what metanorms are in detail is a problem for the relativist. I would have thought it was very much the other way around, so that the relativist and the person who denies relativism would both agree that if there are metanorms that could kind of push us towards resolution, right, that might then be a solution to disagreement. At a certain level, all the relativist needs is an agreement to that at a certain level of abstraction. Sure, if there is some moving principle that would push you towards resolution, right, that's going to be a problem for you. So the relativist might say, so show me that there's a coherent concept there, and give me some examples. It really seems that the burden of proof is on the person who denies relativism to articulate the concept. So I just wasn't sure why you were presenting this as a problem for relativism. It seems like a problem for the non-relativists.
Okay, thank you. So the reason I was that I would take it to be a problem for the relativist, I guess, to put it one way, if you're a card-carrying objectivist, it's within your right to say that facts about what people can and can't come to an agreement about are irrelevant with respect to the truth of absolutism or relativism or objectivism or positions like these. The objectivist, I think, is going to diagnose particular historical disputes in such a way as to say that there are actually no facts about what individuals can and can't achieve in a dialectical context that's going to be evidence for, or particularly, or entail the truth of absolutism, relativism, or any other position like that. The relativist is relying on the idea that there are some, and I call it in the book, dialogic facts, facts about properties that happen to occur that are features of actual dialogues, that the presence of such properties actually matters for whether or not relativism is true. So the relativist, at least the relativist that argues in this way, not all relativists. Macfarlane doesn't depend on anything like this. But relativists who argue that there are things that can't be found in a dialectical context, and that the fact that those things can't be found should lead us to relativism, ought to be able to say, what exactly is it that can't be found? Or so I say. They need to be able to articulate that in a coherent way, such that the objectivist doesn't need to be able to do so similarly. We can talk about that later if you want.
Yes, thanks. So can I just ask about I guess, using the Galileo and Bellarmine case example. So, like in that case, it seems to me that there is an available meta-norm that they would both kind of agree on as appropriate and neutral, and it's discriminatory in a fairly straightforward sense. It's just like use whatever standard or method or whatever that is most likely to get at the truth or something like that. It's just the problem in that case is that Bellarmine and Galileo disagree about which method will get you, or is most likely to get you at the truth. And so the problem isn't so much that there isn't a metanorm available, but rather they disagree on what the metanorm that they do agree on, which standard would be kind of licensed by that, or which regular first order norm would be favored by them. Does that seem right to you? Or I mean, I don't think I'm disagreeing with anything you said. It's just that it seems like a better way for the relativists to go.
I talk about some of that stuff a little bit later in the talk, unfortunately, and I screwed up and have too many slides. So there are some things that I have to say that are in response to that. Really quickly, though, I think that Hales or Rorty would both look at a case like Bellarmine and Galileo, or a similar case where someone is just pointing to science, another person is pointing to some type of a dogma, and say that already we have the ingredients for an argument for relativism insofar as it turns out that regardless of what metanorm is available, in the sense of what were they to avail themselves to the best standards of their own rationality or something like that, they could discover. The fact is that given that it would be difficult to, or given that they couldn't, or that they in fact didn't, that's already significant for relativism. And that type of an argument, I think, is really problematic. There are ways to make it slightly better, which I talk about later, but the version that I think would be embraced by most relativists is just that if they in fact can't find mutually agreeing, a mutually appropriately neutral and appropriately discriminatory common ground, then that matters. That's enough right there for relativism, which I think is problematic.
I wonder if you can help me understand why you're thinking about being discriminatory in the way that you are. I may have sort of misunderstood, but usually I take it when people are having disagreements and there's problems with them having different standards, what you usually want is, by common ground, we mean something like, can you come to some agreement upon what thing would decide between these two different standards? But that wasn't the way you were talking about being discriminatory. You were talking about it being kind of more likely for one to be true versus the other.
Well, that was the first like
but all of them had
pinata
something
that I
like-
tried to beat as a
all of
bad
them had something like this quality, right? So one was they had different dependency relations or
Yeah.
metanorms. In other words, well, if this metanorm is right, then this one's more likely to be true. It's pretty similar, right, epistemically speaking. And the other one was the other one was different. That was weird. But I take it that, I mean, that just seems really different to what I would use if I saw two people with different standards arguing. It's not like I would turn up and say, we have to come upon some standard that will make it more likely that you're right. That seems like a really strange way of going. I would have thought I would get them to try and come to some agreement about what would make a difference in terms of some test or some bit of evidence. And so it's not obvious to me what metanorms, what work they're doing here.
So, if I understand the point you made just a moment ago, so first off, what work metanorms are doing, insofar as I think none, because I'm not a relativist. I think that it's a mistake, it's a red herring to point to facts about what can and can't be identified in the context of a dispute and infer relativism from it. But I think you raised an interesting question, which I wish I would have also put as another example of a way to think about finding a metanorm that doesn't work, which is to suppose, what are we expecting these two individuals to do? Are they supposed to not only find something that they point out that we both believe M is a metanorm and it's appropriately neutral. We could both agree on M without begging the question against one another, but also we have to find something that's appropriately discriminatory, and that would involve us agreeing that M would favor, of course they're not going to agree that it's going to favor one rather than the other, because then it isn't appropriately neutral. What I had in mind is something like, maybe they would need to say that M is such that it could in principle favor one rather than the other. But I think it's incumbent upon the relativist to at least say that that would be the sort of thing that disputants would be looking for, such that if they couldn't find it, that would be their evidence, because if I'm right, at least, it's not that hard to locate appropriately neutral metanorms. If A, then A.
So is the in-principle one something you thought about?
I didn't think about it the way you put it. I like that. I think, again, there will be further problems for the relativists if they try to define it that way, but I like the way you put that.
Just have two more questions.
Yeah, sure.
You were suggesting that somehow both skepticism and relativism can equally at some juncture when you've seen something. And I guess, I was hinting that I thought skepticism could be ruled out just by consideration of self-defeat. So what I mean is, this would be skepticism about the epistemic fact and the realist is true, versus a relativistic way of responding to that situation, whatever the argument seems to be. And the thing I was thinking is that, it's part of putting forward even a skeptical point, is that you would put it forward as justified by the considerations that you've given. So it would really pull the rug out from under your own feet to say, and by the way, I have no idea what justifies any particular thing, because it's just somehow a presupposition of judgment itself. That you think your own judgment is somehow or other justified. So skepticism seems not to be a real option right away, and then the relativist branches are there. Now, I think they're equally problematic, but not in the same obvious way, in a different way.
Thanks. I think, well, on the one hand, I glossed over a point, which is that on some construals of Pyrrhonian skepticism, I think the distinction is urbane and rustic Pyrrhonism. There's one version of Pyrrhonism that isn't going to allow you to even put forward your own thesis. There's another version according to which I think you aren't even allowed to assent to the appearances or something like that. So there are ways of construing Pyrrhonian skepticism according to which it wouldn't make sense to move from disagreement, the idea of Sextus's equivalence or something like that, then all of a sudden I have a substantive philosophical position, skepticism. What I had in mind when suggesting... that the relativist is begging the question against the skepticism by moving from the premise that there can be no non-relative resolution of the dispute in question to the conclusion that relativism is true, is that, as Hales puts it in his 2014 paper, he views it as a process of elimination strategy that gets you from premise 3, that there can't be a non-relative resolution to the dispute, to the conclusion that relativism is true, because the process of elimination strategy is to get rid of, well, there's not an ambiguity, that's not the problem, it's not something else, and as Hales puts it, skepticism, that would be just to throw in the towel, so our only option is relativism. I'm not a skeptic, but I think that attempting to get to relativism from the fact that there can be no rational resolution of an agreement would be to beg the question against the skeptic in some type of dialectically objectionable way. But that is against a background of thinking that skepticism is also pretty problematic.
Many thanks. I thought your framing of the Bellarmine Galileo debate is very helpful to historians, very clear. It's a bitter irony, is it not, though? I mean, the whole point of Galileo was, of course, he thought he was introducing a neutral way of looking at the world. So that's the bitter irony. But my question on that would be, just from the point of view of sort of history, philosophy, science, would you not agree as well that, it wasn't so much a question of a philosophical outlook of dogma. What Galileo was facing was the problem with the tensor was new. It was a new piece of equipment that people didn't trust. Like for Bellarmine, for the Bellarmine and his colleagues, or indeed the philosophers of the time, to say, oh, we get to study, we agree with this guy, Galileo, would have required an enormous amount of trust in a new technology that nobody was familiar with and had no idea how to interpret, except for a very select few. So I would argue, when you look at the history of science, you see that pattern all the time. It's very little to do with religious dogma and even philosophical dogma, but to do with a new piece of technology comes along, it seems to suggest something new about the world, and most people simply can't accept it, because why should they? They have no trust in this technology. Would you say that?
That's a good point. I was reading, just as before falling asleep lately, this long book about like the Jesuits and technology and during that period of time, and came to realize that there are a lot of descriptions about that particular debate that would inform the way we would think about it if we brought in further historical facts. One thing that is important, though, is that at least for the relativist perspective, it doesn't have to be Galileo and Bellarmine. It could be any case of a deep disagreement. And one thing that Hales suggests is he suggests sort of we could also just come up with possible cases, fictional cases. We can think up thought experiments where we have dueling dogmas. One dogma that says this, the other dogma that says that. One worry that I have about moving to relativism from a possibilist construal of the type of disagreements that are relevant is that you could imagine dueling dogmas cases for just about every single subject matter possible, from mathematics to whatever type of domains of discourse that we think are on sure footing, and that leads us to de facto global relativism. If we think that possible disagreements such that they lack an Archimedean metanorm should lead us to relativism, then we have to be global, and then we have to deal with Protagoras, and it's dreadful. So we don't want to be possibilists. I think we do need to stick with historical cases. So.
Well, thank you all very much for a great talk.
Thank you very much.
Yes, there's coffee downstairs in the foyer.
In about 20 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
So